The word legend gets tossed around a lot, but no one can argue that when Tom Petty passed away at the age of 66, the world did lose an actual legend. For all his success, through all the fame, and for all his popularity, one thing everyone who knew him seemed to agree on was that he was precisely the persona he projected on stage. That's reflected in what he once told Esquire. Do something you really like, and hopefully it pays the rent. In the topsy-turvy world of video games, nothing is for certain. A major name in the title doesn't always translate to sales success. Just ask E.T. A world-class designer in the driver's seat doesn't mean a game will be an instant hit. Sorry, mister, as far as I'm concerned, that's success. Wise words. Schaefer. Even the most trusted names in the industry deliver the occasional clunker. Hey there, Virtual Boy. And while a sequel to a well-received title usually does pretty well, it's far from a sure bet. Dead Space, we're looking at you. On the flip side, sometimes the biggest hits come out of nowhere. That game with the janky trailer, warmed-over game mechanics, dated graphics, and seemingly lackluster development team. That might just end up being great. As the following games prove, even experienced professionals can't always tell how well a game is going to do from its pre-launch materials, so keep your eyes peeled. What else should you know about him? He didn't mind when people plagiarized his music, even if imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. It's strictly hands-off for most artists and writers. You never know which flop is actually going to be gaming's next big thing. Fortnite wasn't always a victory royale. Remember when Fortnite was a simple multiplayer survival game and not the biggest thing on the planet? No? Well, let us refresh your memory. For years, it seemed like Fortnite wasn't even going to come out. Epic announced Fortnite way back at Spike TV's Video Game Awards in 2011. Then, it more or less vanished. During development, Epic pitched the game as Minecraft meets Left 4 Dead, and when members of the press finally got their hands on the game, that's more or less what they got, and little more. But while Petty had his share of experiences with parts of his music turning up in other hit songs, he never seemed bitter about any of it. A 2015 preview from Ars Technica called Fortnite, a big mishmash of genres that doesn't quite gel into a satisfying whole, and condemned the whole thing as overly complicated. PC Gamer claimed that the game was less satisfying than similar games. When an early access version of Fortnite arrived in 2017, things didn't get much better. In 2006, headlines in the New York Post, via Rolling Stone, suggested Petty could have a pretty good lawsuit against the Red Hot Chili Peppers. Polygon admired the amount of work that Epic had put into making Fortnite better, but admitted that, "I'm still not sure I'm having fun." And then, Epic added the free-to-play Battle Royale mode, and everything changed. The similarities between Mary Jane's Last Dance and Donny California were obvious enough that everyone saw it, but according to Petty's statement, those things just. In fall 2017, Fortnite started riding the momentum of PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds. Happened. The truth is, I seriously doubt that there is any negative intent there, he said. Epic hasn't looked back since. In March 2018, Fortnite made Epic $25 million from its invite-only mobile iOS edition alone. Over 3 million people can be found playing Fortnite at any given time. That's not bad, especially for a game that people initially dismissed as an uninspired knockoff. Doom is doomed, or is it? No, not the original Doom. ID Software's 1993 PC game, which helped usher in the era of polygonal 3D graphics and almost single-handedly made first-person shooters a thing, was highly anticipated from the very beginning. In fact, people were so excited that when the game first released as a shareware title, id servers couldn't handle all of the traffic. When asked if he planned to sue, he said he might if it was maliciously lifted note for note, but not in this case. When players finally did manage to download the game, they weren't disappointed. That kind of legacy is hard to live up to, though, and for a long time it didn't look like id and Bethesda's soft reboot of the franchise was going to. I don't believe in lawsuits much, he added. The latest Doom started production in 2008. 3 years later, id threw everything out and started over. It took another 5 years for Doom to hit the market, and along the way, it failed to impress. I think there are enough frivolous lawsuits in this country without people fighting over pop songs. His laid-back attitude showed up again in 2015, when he ended up with a writing credit on Sam Smith's Stay With Me, after similarities were pointed out. Again, he was brilliantly deferential, saying to Rolling Stone, All my years of songwriting have shown me these things can happen. A musical accident, no more, no less. He played for another band under 2 fake names. When it comes to supergroups, you can't get much bigger than the Traveling Wilburys. They got together in 1988, a set of organic accidents that brought Petty together with Bob Dylan, George Harrison, Roy Orbison, and Jeff Lynne, pictured, center. At first, they were the Trembling Wilburys, and according to Rock and Roll Detective, it was a misspelling on a guitar pick that gave them the name they finally stuck with. Each band member came up with a Wilbury pseudonym, and Petty was initially credited as Charlie T. The game's trailers were full of cheesy machismo. Junior Wilbury. Later, when they released Volume. The multiplayer demo was a disaster, leading to a flood of negative Steam reviews. 3. He became Muddy Wilbury. The box art made it look like id was embarrassed by its flagship franchise, and critics didn't get review copies in advance, which is usually a bad sign. Well, surprise. Doom is good. The names of the band were inscribed on guitar picks, and it wasn't just the megastar members who had pseudonyms. Really, really, really good. Not only did Doom successfully recapture the original's charm, with quick-paced and bloody combat that's designed to keep you on your toes, but it sold well and landed a number of Game of the Year awards, too. Other band members did, too, with some of their real identities still a mystery. He got addicted to heroin in the 90s. The first time Petty ever spoke about his heroin addiction was for his unauthorized biography by Warren Zanes. It wasn't a sure thing, but Doom is back. It was only unauthorized because Petty insisted he wouldn't tell Zanes what he could include and what he couldn't. When Zanes spoke with The Washington Post in 2015, the first thing that came up was the revelation Petty had turned to heroin at 50. That happens when the pain becomes too much, Zanes said. We couldn't be happier. Is Until Dawn B-list or A+? In the mid to late the Nintendo Wii was breaking sales records left and right, and Sony and Microsoft decided that they wanted in. So, in 2009, Sony introduced the PlayStation Move, a camera-based motion control solution that was far more accurate and reliable than either Nintendo or Microsoft's offerings. He added Petty had become overwhelmed and didn't know what else to do, and he'd stayed quiet about his addiction because he didn't want anyone to think of it as a viable option for them just because he'd done it. While critics liked the Move hardware, its launch was marred by one critical flaw: the Move didn't have very many good games. Until Dawn, a first-person horror game, was supposed to be the answer. Zanes reassured him his was a cautionary tale, revealing that Petty's heroin addiction came at a time when he was dealing with divorce, with living alone, and with the realization that he couldn't do anything to make sure his kids had the life he wanted for them. The classic situation of midlife pinning a person down to the mat, Zanes called it. His friendship with George Harrison and Petty collaborated for the Traveling Wilburys, but they were way more than just colleagues, they were close friends. In Until Dawn, players would use the Move to control an in-game flashlight while exploring an abandoned cabin and making choices that affected the game's outcome. When Warren Zanes talked to The Washington Post about just how close, he said they were the kind of friends only they could understand. No matter how corny it might sound, they were kind of falling in love with each other, he said, going on to add that at their level of success, true friendship isn't just hard to find, it's almost non-existent. It was an interesting idea, but there was a problem. Quite simply, Until Dawn didn't look very good. Not only were motion controls on their way out by 2012, but Until Dawn's first trailer looks low-tech, and it's dripping with cheese. When Petty and Harrison met and collaborated, Zanes said it was the happiest he'd ever seen him. When Petty himself spoke with NPR, he called Harrison an older brother. Things got worse as the game progressed, too. Who I could go to with my troubles and questions, and said he credited Harrison with giving him a sense of spirituality. He was 13 when he first saw the Beatles on The Ed Sullivan Show, but their friendship was instant. He did, however, decline to share specific memories because he had thousands and thousands of them. He was abused by his father. Everyone has moments from their childhood that define them, and for Petty, his adult outlook was shaped by an abusive childhood. He spoke with Men's Journal in 2013, talking a bit about the violence he saw in his father and his grandfather.
Petty's grandfather was born in Georgia, a logger who married a Cherokee woman and, possibly, hacked a man to death with an axe over comments about interracial marriage. Developer Supermassive Games added some real Hollywood talent to the roster. but dropped the motion controls and transformed the game into a choose-your-own-adventure-style movie, robbing Until Dawn of its biggest hook. Hands-on previews shortly before release called out Until Dawn's grating voice acting, unintentionally creepy character models, and stereotypical storyline. Nobody expected much. Everyone was wrong. His father, Earl, was raised in Florida after the family fled, and Petty said he was an angry drunk who regularly beat him, his siblings, and his devoted mother. His mother introduced him to music, which became his safe place, even though Petty suspected his father hated him so much because of his interest in music and the arts. Earl Petty's shadow continued to follow him, and he rebelled against authority for a long time. Until Dawn sold significantly better than expected, launching an entire franchise. After going to therapy, he learned to deal with his own anger issues, saying, "I thank everyone who put up with that for as long as they did." He regretted using the Confederate flag in his performances. The Confederate flag and the dispute over its heritage or racism is a hot-button topic, and Petty once flew the flag at his 1985 Southern Accents tour. After South Carolina took down its Confederate flag in 2015, he spoke to Rolling Stone to apologize for his own use of it. "I always knew it had to do with the Civil War, but the South had adopted it as its logo," he said. "It's got both a shooting-focused spin-off and a virtual reality prequel. I was pretty ignorant of what it actually meant. It's campy and cliched, sure. It's also a ton of fun. Forget the jump scares. That Until Dawn is actually great might be the game's biggest and best surprise of all. Deus Ex ain't no hack. Don't blame Deus Ex for fans' low expectations. It's not the game's fault. Sure, these days, Deus Ex might be considered one of the best games ever made, but Warren Spector's cyberpunk RPG wasn't always held in such high regard. While Spector was already well known for his contributions to games like Wing Commander and Thief, The Dark Project, the studio behind him had some issues. It's like how a swastika looks to a Jewish person. He linked the presence of the flag to his song, Rebels, and said it was the best way he knew to illustrate the song's narrator. In short, its games kind of sucked. Dominion. Storm over Gift 3, which was already partially completed when Ion Storm took it on, was supposed to be a quick and easy project. It ran way over budget, took longer to complete than expected, and flopped at the marketplace. But it made him uncomfortable enough that he even requested people stop bringing flags to the shows. It wasn't who he was or what he stood for, he said, and the fact it got a mixed reaction from the crowd didn't really bother him. Instead, he went out of his way to try to set things right. Daikatana, which was designed by id Software vet John Romero, launched with a hyper-aggressive marketing campaign. "Yeah, this is the John Romero's about to make you his bitch game," that the final product couldn't live up to. Anachronox, a sci-fi RPG, reviewed well but cost too much to make, especially given its lackluster sales. Fans expected Deus Ex to be more of the same, and morale at the studio took a major hit. "I went back and had it removed from the record. In fact, Ion Storm's reputation was so bad that the team had problems recruiting programmers. I still feel bad about it." In Game Developer magazine, Spector writes, "Too many talented people told us that while they would like to work on Deus Ex, they couldn't work for Ion Storm. Thankfully, on release, players came around. Ion Storm might not exist anymore. The studio shut down in 2005, but through Deus Ex, its legacy lives on. Mario plus Rabbids is the crossover nobody wanted, but everyone loved. You only need one word to sum up the internet's reaction when news about Mario plus Rabbids. Kingdom Battle leaked on the internet. Huh? Mario plus Rabbids was, for all intents and purposes, the very last game that anyone expected to see. Not only is Nintendo notoriously protective of its characters, but Ubisoft's mischievous and hyperactive mascots tend to be incredibly divisive. I've always just regretted it. I would never do anything to hurt someone." His influences included his time as a gravedigger in 2011. Petty took part in a Q&A on his own SiriusXM show, Tom Petty's Buried Treasure, via The Hollywood Reporter. Host Meg Griffin asked him listener-submitted questions, and when she asked about his influences, he had some seriously eclectic answers.
There was AM radio, of course, and his first record purchase was the Marvelettes' 1962 album Playboy, purchased with cash scraped together from turning in Coke bottles. You either love him or you really, really don't. At first, nothing about Mario plus Rabbids made sense. One of his early jobs was as a gravedigger, an occupation where he didn't have to look too sharp. He addressed another rumor, that he planted the University of Florida's Tom Petty tree. Whatever else sparked the creativity of a young Petty, it wasn't the University of Florida. The tree wasn't his doing at all. He voiced a character on King of the Hill. Love it or hate it, the staying power of King of the Hill is undeniable. Why was a selfie-obsessed Rabid dressed in a Princess Peach Halloween costume? Why was Mario using a gun? Naturally, the online reaction to the game was swift and furious. VG247 called it an abomination. One critic pretended to throw his Switch in the garbage. When the Chicago Tribune talked to Mike Judge in 2009, he said one his favorite parts of the show's run was the fact they got Petty to voice a character originally described as Tom Petty without the success. Judge said it was kind of on a whim. They figured they'd try to get Petty to do the voice for Lucky, adding they were shocked he was actually up for doing it, and then he just killed at the table read. He ended up a series regular for 5 years, an impressive commitment to make. He got turned on to music after meeting Elvis. Petty told Men's Journal that his mother was his everything growing up, crediting her with keeping an element of civilization in the house. Because of her, his first musical influences were people like Nat King Cole and music from West Side Story, songs that never failed to remind him of her. Another user, jokingly, threatened to drown himself in the ocean. Once they got a television, he started to realize there was a great big world out there beyond the hellish family life he was trapped in. Los Angeles, Television City. When it turned out that Mario plus Rabbids was a tactics game, a genre that normally appeals to a pretty hardcore audience, people were even more confused. That became my way out. When he was 11, he had a brief run-in with Elvis Presley at an Ocala movie shoot, and that was it. He later told Billboard, "It wasn't like meeting Jesus, but it was close." He went home, asked his mother to buy him a guitar from Sears, started spending his free time in a local music shop, and became determined to play the same rock and roll Elvis did. Mario plus Rabbids E3 showing made Jake Solomon, the creative director on XCOM 2, drop his jaw. And yet, in spite of all this criticism, Mario plus Rabbids Kingdom Battle succeeded. Instead of annoying players, the Rabbids were praised for providing new, and hilarious, takes on Nintendo's classic characters. The grid-based battles were so well executed that they made Solomon reconsider the entire genre. By 14, he had formed his first band, the Sundowners, and never looked back. His marijuana use was pretty constant. Petty told Men's Journal, "I've had a pipeline of marijuana since 1967. While he scoffed at the idea of needing a prescription, he did talk freely about some of his experiences with what he called a musical drug. As a longtime history buff, he had a tradition every time he was in Washington, D.C. Head to the Jefferson Memorial late at night, get stoned, and simply sit. Petty also kept the first really nice car he was ever able to buy, a 1979 Mercedes 450 SL. Mario plus Rabbids went on to become the best-selling Switch game made outside of Nintendo, and for good reason. It's wacky, but at the end of the day, it just worked. Final Fantasy XIV. An epic save. Unlike the other games on this list, Final Fantasy XIV wasn't expected to flop. It did flop. Even then it simply sat, as Petty shared he was too spaced out to drive anymore. His final time behind the wheel of a car he'd fully believed a pack of UFOs was descending on Malibu, only to spin off the road and into a pack of paparazzi. The silver balls were really there, but they were balloons Adam Sandler had launched to keep aerial nuisances away from his wedding. That same night, Petty backed into another car and decided he was done driving. He was fiercely anti-corporate. Corporate sponsorships are the norm, but Petty stubbornly refused to accept them in any of his tours. When Billboard asked him about it in 2005, he said he decided to go that route with his business model because he wanted to keep ticket prices down and allow everyone the chance to come to a concert. Big time. It's not heroic, he told them, going on to say he refused to let his music be used in advertising. When Square Enix released the second Final Fantasy MMORPG in 2010, it wasn't just a bad game, it was an unmitigated disaster. The developers at Square Enix allegedly valued graphics more than the gameplay, and the entire game suffered as a result. Only 20 players could appear on screen. Servers crashed all the time. The user interface was an indecipherable mess. The quests weren't fun or interesting, and nobody, not critics, not fans, and not the developers, really liked it. After a couple of months, Square Enix realized that something had to be done. "I didn't write my songs to be orange juice commercials," he said. That's gotten him his share of critics over the years, who told him he could be making more money than he was. Saving Final Fantasy XIV took more than a patch, however. The only way to salvage the game was to throw everything out and start from scratch. He believed it didn't matter, saying the integrity of the music and the band was more important. That's exactly what Square Enix did. The company brought in Naoki Yoshida, a die-hard MMORPG fan, to write the ship. Yoshida completely restructured the Final Fantasy XIV team and slowly brought the game closer to other MMORPGs. The result, Final Fantasy XIV, A Realm Reborn, isn't as unique as what came before. It's selling out, he felt, making music common and irrelevant. In 2014, NPR asked him how he was able to reconcile his own financial wealth with his views on how money corrupts. On the other hand, it's actually playable. According to Petty, the difference was that he not only came from a humble start, but that he doesn't go out of his way to step on people or hurt others to make a buck. That's where the real problems start. He predicted his final tour would be his last show. Hindsight can be an eerie thing, and everything was hunky-dory when he kicked off his 40th anniversary tour. He wasn't shy about saying it might be his last, telling Rolling Stone, "I don't want to spend my life on the road." That was in December 2016, after a 3-year lull in touring. We'll take it. Final Fantasy XIV, A Realm Reborn relaunched in 2013. It was the longest they'd been off stage in 25 years, but Petty said he had other priorities he was thinking of. There were other ways he wanted to spend that time, like with his granddaughter. It did much, much better. Critics showered the game with praise, especially its well-told and compelling storyline, which is just as good as the ones in Final Fantasy's single-player installments. By 2016, Final Fantasy XIV had over 6 million players. I'd be lying if I didn't say I was thinking this might be the last big one. That's not to say there weren't big plans in the works, though. It's gotten a few massive expansion packs. It is, by almost every metric, an unqualified success. Dying Light isn't DOA. Techland fooled fans once. Mike Campbell stressed that the possibility of calling it quits had nothing to do with conflict or the typical drama, saying they still had a chemistry and a telepathy between us that is really rare. At the time, Petty was still overseeing his own SiriusXM radio station, producing albums, planning dates, and tossing around the idea of doing a few shows based on the Wildflower album. But the final words would prove heartbreaking. He said, "We're very aware that time is finite. At the end of the year we'll say, 'What do you feel like doing?' Then we'll figure out where to go next." He fought his record company over $1. Petty released Hard Promises in 1981, and it wasn't easy. They weren't going to let it happen again. Oh, Dead Island, Techland's 2011 undead survival game, sold well. How could it not? The game's reveal trailer, which told a surprisingly emotional story about a young girl's transformation into a zombie, went viral, amassing over 1 million views and getting everyone pumped for the game. Unfortunately, Dead Island didn't deliver. His huge popularity was great and all, but it also influenced the label's decision on how to roll out what they called superstar pricing. That was MCA's catchy name for putting a higher price tag on albums they knew were going to sell well, raising the price of Hard Promises from the standard $8.98 to $9.98. Having none of that nonsense, Petty took a stand. It's got some interesting ideas, but as critics note, the game is so glitchy, so ugly, and so repetitive that it's hard to sink your teeth into. When Techland released Dead Island, Riptide, the first game's equally buggy standalone expansion, the hype died out entirely, and when Techland announced that it was making another game set during the zombie apocalypse, one that looked a lot like Dead Island, too, thanks to its open-world design and complex crafting system, it didn't seem like a good sign. He told the New York Times, via Ultimate Classic Rock, that while MCA had been great when it came to selling and promoting, they couldn't see the reality of what it's like on the street. They couldn't see that raising the album's price wouldn't be fair. Petty didn't balk, telling MCA he would rather not release the album at all than raise the price. Either it was $8.98, retitled $8.98, or it just wasn't going to happen. Besides, in a world full of Resident Evil, Dead Rising, Days, Plants vs. Zombies, and so many others, did we really need another zombie game? Common wisdom said no. But Techland promised that it would do better. He didn't want to be the one that resulted in album prices going up, and even though he told Tom Snyder he knew it was going to happen eventually, he was happy when he won and it wasn't with his album. This was just very pleasing to me because it was one situation where the audience actually won an issue. He was vocal about how he didn't like newer music listened to any of Petty's music, and it's clear his influences come from that sweet spot in music history where country and rock and roll were running side by side and changing how the world thought. Elvis was his inspiration, after all, and he's worked with greats like Roy Orbison and Johnny Cash. When it came to new music, he wasn't shy about saying what he thought. When he talked to Rolling Stone in 2013, he said he couldn't think of any music he'd heard lately that impressed him, but he clarified his comments at a recent show. He'd said modern country was like bad rock with a fiddle, and he meant it. It does seem to be missing that magic element that it used to have. We had to learn some lessons the hard way, producer Timon Smektala said. We really feel we need to prove to people that we have made a AAA game. It wasn't just talk. I don't really see a George Jones or a Buck Owens or anything that fresh coming up, he said. It's not just country that irked him, either. In 2006, Esquire quoted him as saying he never would have been successful if he'd had to start his career then because radio doesn't take a chance on anything anymore. They've streamlined the playlists to the lowest common denominator. Lamenting the fact people would rather listen to the same thing over and over instead of something new. He also said that's a product of the time. With so much focus on school, kids didn't have time to be creative, and that made him sad. He hit it big in England before the US. You can't get much more American than Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers, but they were something of a US techland succeeded. Flop until they headed across the pond to impress English audiences with their sound. Dying Light quickly shambled to the top of the sales charts, spawning both a popular expansion pack and a Battle Royale-inspired spin-off. Dying Light didn't just succeed. In 1976, the group released its debut album to poor sales. It launched an entire franchise, proving that, for Techland at least, the third time really is the charm. A crowdfunding failure draws quite the crowd. Five Nights at Freddy's has conquered YouTube. Rolling Stone said it wasn't until they went to England to tour with and open for Nils Lofgren the album started to sell. It dominates the toy store shelves. It was only a matter of weeks before they were a headline act, breaking into first British then American charts. It wasn't an easy tour, either. It spawned hundreds, thousands, of fan games, gotten its own theme park attraction, and is currently making its way to the big screen under the stewardship of Home Alone and Harry Potter director Chris Columbus. All that, and it almost didn't happen. According to Rolling Stone, the Heartbreakers' increasing popularity led to some serious tension between Lofgren and the American upstarts. Campbell went on record as saying the more of a reaction they got, the less room on stage they got, too. As for Petty, he just called them a string of expletives. He believed music was true magic. There's something ethereal about a concert, and Petty's shows were nothing but at all. For some reason, nobody seemed to think that a low-budget horror game set in an off-brand Chuck E. He used the word magic to describe every part of the musical experience, from telling MTV about the magical process of songwriting. It's kind of like an orgasm, to once telling The Telegraph, music is probably the only real magic I have encountered in my life. There's not some trick involved with it. Cheeses would be a hit. After all, while developer Scott Cawthon has been making games for decades, he made his very first title, Doofus, when he was still in school. Very few were hits. It's pure and it's real. And it moves and it heals and it communicates and does all these incredible things. Some were straight up bad. Cawthon's Christian-based games didn't sell, and the game that he made before Freddy's, Chipper and Sons Lumber Co., received such negative reviews, especially from YouTube critic Jim Sterling, who compared Chipper and Sons characters to creepy animatronics, that Cawthon became suicidal. It's been so good to me that I want to be good to it. Head to a magic show, and you'll see some tricks. He almost stopped making games entirely. So, when Cawthon put Five Nights at Freddy's up on Kickstarter, it's not too surprising that it ended up being a hard sell. Cawthon asked for $10,000. Head to a concert, and you'll feel that same mysterious force, without the deception. He got nothing. According to Petty, that's real magic. He'd seen the effects of it, too, and told NPR that if he thought about the connection music made between him and those who listened to it, he felt it was equal parts thrilling and terrifying. 'Cause it's kind of like, did I do that? He said. Nada. After Freddy's failed to pull in any cash during those crucial early days, Cawthon pulled the plug on the campaign. He even claimed he'd heard of 2 people who had come out of comas to his songs. He went ahead and made the game anyway. If true, that would indeed be real magic. He intentionally bankrupted himself. The music industry is built on trades, contracts, and shady dealings, and in 1979 Petty had enough. The group had originally signed with Shelter, but when Shelter was bought by MCA, Petty made it clear he didn't appreciate being part of the deal. History quoted him as saying it was like being bought and sold like a piece of meat, and he was unhappy with the terms of his contract. A year later, he was doling out $250,000 to charities, writing spin-off novels, and presumably saving more than enough that to, live on. Nice work, Scott. A hit emerges from Mordor's shadow, an open world full of danger. To be fair, they weren't great terms. They already had 2 major albums sell extraordinarily well, but they hadn't seen much in the way of financial gain from it. Towers that reveal secrets when you reach the tippy top. That's mostly because artists didn't get royalties until they paid studios back for everything from their advances to marketing expenses, studio time, and tour expenses. A long and complex backstory that you're welcome to ignore. Combat that blends stealth kills with melee combat. Sound shady? He thought so. The album looming on the horizon was Damn the Torpedoes, and it's the one that everyone knows. Petty sat on it, refused to release it under the contract he was under, and took on all the recording and production costs himself. That put him a whopping $500,000 in debt, and he declared bankruptcy. It was all intentional, as a way to get some leverage in court when it came time to demand release from an unfair contract. It worked. MCA relented and re-signed the group, and Damn the Torpedoes was a major success. A broken hand nearly ended his career. Anyone familiar with the creative process knows there are things that come easy and things that come hard. A hero that can scale cliffs, buildings, and mountains. We're talking about Assassin's Creed, right? Nope, although you'd be forgiven for making that mistake. Southern accents came with what Ultimate Classic Rock described as roiling chaos, and amid the album's birthing pains was some serious insanity. You wouldn't be the first one. When Warner Brothers. Drummer Stan Lynch even said, Tom was dancing with the devil at that point. And Monolith Productions first unveiled Middle-earth, Shadow of Mordor. More than one person noticed that it looked a lot like Ubisoft's time-hopping franchise. After seeing gameplay footage, one of Ubisoft's developers even accused Shadow of Mordor of stealing code from Assassin's Creed 2, although he later backtracked and clarified that the 2 games simply looked similar. Monolith claimed that Mordor's so-called Nemesis system would be more than enough to make it stand apart. Given the quality of most licensed games, however, and the Lord of the Rings rocky history as far as games are concerned, most people dismissed Shadow of Mordor right off the bat. But Monolith's developers weren't lying, and when Shadow of Mordor arrived, fans quickly changed their tune. Something was going to happen real bad. It wasn't helped along by the drugs, and it almost ended his career one day when, frustrated by the whole mess, Petty stormed out of the studio, punched a wall, and shattered his hand. I had been working on the album for over a year, and I thought I was finally about done. Yes, the combat, stealth, and open-world mechanics felt awfully derivative, but it didn't matter. The Nemesis system, which dynamically creates different arch-foes for every player, ended up being even more compelling than advertised. Shadow of Mordor went on to become the best-selling game based on Tolkien's works, and for good reason. It's not much of a Lord of the Rings story, but as a game? Open worlds don't get much better. Sometimes, Nintendo is just plain wrong. You know Pokémon, right? The franchise that sold over 300 million video games? The one that sparked 20 years' worth of cartoons, moved 23.6 billion trading cards, and drawn over 74 million people into movie theaters? Yeah, that Pokémon.
Well, here's a secret. The first 2 games, Pokémon Red and Pokémon Green, weren't supposed to be hits. But I sat down and listened to one of the songs and I knew it still wasn't right, Petty said later, insisting it wasn't pure fury that caused the accident. Nintendo executives thought that the game would tank, and tank hard. If series creator Satoshi Tajiri had listened to them, the game probably wouldn't exist at all. His doctor told him he may have lost his ability to play guitar, but when he was interviewed in 1985, via the Chicago Tribune, the only remaining evidence was a scar. As Tajiri tells the story, he originally came up with Pokémon after learning about the Game Boy's link cable, which allowed users to play across consoles in the pre-internet days. In 2012, Petty said the old injury was acting up again, but he chalked it up to old age, via digital spy. His first guitar lessons came from the Eagles' Don Felder. Even the best have to start somewhere, and Petty started at a local music store in his Florida hometown. Also spending time in the same Gainesville music store was Don Felder, who would go on to his own kind of fame with the Eagles. Collecting and trading creatures, Tajiri thought, would be a fun way to bring players together, and he pitched the game to Nintendo's higher-ups as early as 1990. Nintendo didn't get it. He talked to Gibson about how he got his start and said early in his career he was working at the store to build up enough credit to buy equipment. Part of his gig was giving lessons, and he said, one day, this kind of scrawny, scraggly, blonde-haired kid came in and wanted guitar lessons. He gave him lessons, and they ultimately became friends. They hung out, they played together, and those lessons obviously stuck with the young Tom Petty. Just don't remind Don Henley of that. According to Ultimate Classic Rock, he had a front-row fan thrown out of a concert for yelling about Felder during Henley's introduction of their new guitarist. Nintendo legend Shigeru Miyamoto took an interest in the game, however, and helped Tajiri and Game Freak develop the title over the next few years. In 1996, when Pokémon finally came out, the Game Boy was on the decline, and Nintendo barely marketed the game thanks to its low expectations. In Japan, Pokémon wasn't an immediate hit, but word of mouth quickly spread. By the time that Pokémon made its way west, it was already a success. It only got bigger. Now, Pokémon is one of Nintendo's most reliable and best-loved franchises and is worth close to $55 billion. The fan pointed out Felder had taught Tom Petty, and it earned him an escorted trip to the door. That's not bad for a flop. Not bad at all.